I thought it would be a simple visit. I arrived at the grand entrance of Zenith Solutions, ready to surprise my husband, the managing director, with his favorite tea. But when I mentioned my name to the guard, he just laughed. "You're not Mrs. Hutchins," he said. "I see the boss's wife every day." He pointed past the authorized personnel only sign to a woman I'd never met. There she is. In that single second, my 25-year marriage wasn't just a lie. It was a joke. I decided to visit my husband at his job as the managing director of Zenith Solutions. At the entrance, there was a sign that said, "Authorized personnel only." When I told the guard I was the managing director's wife, he laughed and said, "Ma'am, I see his wife every day. There she is coming out right now." So, I decided to play along. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought a simple surprise visit would shatter everything I believed about my 25-year marriage. My name is Grace. I'm 56 years old, and until that Thursday afternoon in October, I thought I knew my husband Leo better than anyone in the world. I thought our marriage was my one blue-chip investment, the single asset I never had to reevaluate. It started as such an innocent idea. Leo had been working late again, pulling those 12 and 14-hour days that came with being managing director. I'd been making dinner for one too many nights, eating alone while he texted me updates about board meetings and client emergencies. That morning, he'd rushed out without his usual thermos of tea, and I thought bringing him his favorite Earl Grey and some homemade scones might brighten his day. It felt like a small, safe deposit into our emotional bank account. The downtown office building gleamed in the autumn sunlight as I pulled into the visitor parking space. I'd only been to Leo's office a handful of times over the years. He always said it was easier to keep work and home separate, a firewall between assets, and I respected that boundary. Maybe I respected too many boundaries. I walked through the towering glass doors carrying the tea and the pastry bag, feeling oddly nervous, like an auditor arriving for an inspection I hadn't scheduled. The lobby was all marble and chrome, the kind of intimidating corporate space that made me grateful for my quiet financial analyst practice. The overhead cost of this lobby alone must have been astronomical. A security guard sat behind an imposing desk, his nameplate reading Walter. "Good afternoon," I said, approaching with what I hoped was a confident smile. "I'm here to see Leo Hutchins. I'm his wife, Grace." Walter looked up from his computer screen, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to something I couldn't quite read. He tilted his head slightly, studying my face as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You said you're Mr. Hutchins's wife?" His voice carried a note of confusion that made my stomach tighten. "Yes, that's right, Grace Hutchins." I brought him his tea. I held up the bag, suddenly feeling foolish, as if I'd brought a crayon drawing to a shareholder meeting. Walter's expression changed completely. His eyebrows shot up, and then he did something that froze my blood. He laughed, not a polite chuckle, but a genuine, bewildered laugh that echoed through the marble lobby. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I see Mrs. Hutchins every day. She just left about 10 minutes ago." Walter gestured toward the elevators with casual certainty. "There she is now, coming back." I turned, following his gaze, and watched a tall woman, in an expensive charcoal suit, stride through the lobby. She was younger than me, maybe early 40s, with the kind of confident bearing that seemed to own every room she entered. Her dark hair was perfectly styled, her shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about her screamed success and authority. The woman nodded to Walter with familiar ease. "Afternoon, Walt." "No problem, Miss Shaw. He's in his office." "Fiona Shaw." I knew that name from Leo's work stories. His director of operations who joined the company 3 years ago. The woman he occasionally mentioned in passing, always in a professional context. Fiona this, Fiona that, always business. My hands felt numb around the tea thermos. The pastry bag crinkled as my grip tightened involuntarily. Everything in me wanted to speak up, to correct this massive, catastrophic error in the ledger. But my voice had completely abandoned me. Walter was looking between Fiona and me now, genuine confusion creasing his features. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but are you sure you're Mr. Hutchins's wife? Because Miss Shaw here is married to him." The words hit me like physical blows. Married to her. Present tense. Not was married, not claims to be married, but a simple matter-of-fact statement that shattered my reality. Fiona paused mid-stride, her attention drawn to our conversation. When her eyes met mine, I saw something flicker across her face. Not guilt, not surprise, but recognition. She knew exactly who I was. "Is there a problem here?" Fiona's voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of a woman accustomed to managing difficult situations, something cold and calculating. A part of my analyst brain I usually reserved for hostile markets took over. Every instinct screamed at me to explode, to demand answers, to create the scene this situation deserved. But a deeper wisdom told me to play along, to gather data. "Oh, you must be Fiona," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Leo's mentioned you. I'm Grace, a friend of the family." The lie tasted bitter, but it bought me time to think. I was just dropping off some documents for Leo. Fiona's shoulders relaxed slightly, but her eyes remained watchful. "Ah, yes. Leo's mentioned you too." "Had he? What had he said?" "He's in meetings most of the afternoon, but I can make sure he gets whatever you brought." I handed over the tea and scones. My movements were mechanical. "Just tell him Grace stopped by." "Of course." Fiona's smile was perfectly professional, perfectly normal, as if we hadn't just had the most surreal conversation of my life. I walked back to my car in a daze, my legs moving without conscious direction. The October air felt sharp against my skin, but I barely noticed. Everything looked the same as when I'd arrived 30 minutes ago. But my world had fundamentally shifted. My portfolio was worthless. Sitting in the driver's seat, I stared at the office building. 25 years of marriage. 25 years of sharing a bed, a home, dreams, fears, inside jokes. 25 years of believing I knew this man completely. My phone buzzed with a text from Leo. "Running late again tonight? Don't wait up. Love you. Love you." The words that had once brought me comfort now felt like another lie in what was apparently a web of deception I'd been blind to. How long had this been going on? How many times had Fiona been introduced as his wife while I sat at home making dinner for one? I started the car and drove home through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. Our house looked the same. The red brick colonial we'd bought when Leo first made partner. The garden I'd insisted on planting. The mailbox with both our names. Everything exactly as I'd left it. Except now I knew it was all built on lies. Inside the house, the silence felt different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a home waiting for its occupants. It was the hollow emptiness of a stage set, a carefully constructed facade. I walked through rooms filled with our shared memories, vacation photos, wedding pictures, the ceramic bowl Leo had made in that pottery class. Had any of it been real? Or was it all just sunk cost? I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. My mind kept replaying the scene at the office, searching for clues I'd missed, explanations that might make sense. But there was only one explanation that fit, and it was one I wasn't ready to accept. The front door opened at 9:30, just as it had countless times before. Leo's shoes clicked against the hardwood floor. His keys jangled as he set them on the hall table. Normal sounds of a normal evening, except nothing was normal anymore. "Grace, I'm home." His voice carried the tired warmth I'd grown accustomed to. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking every inch the successful managing director in his tailored navy suit. His dark hair still perfectly arranged. "How was your day?" I asked, the question automatic. He sighed, loosening his tie. "Exhausting. Back-to-back meetings all afternoon. Did you eat already?" I nodded, studying his face for any sign of deception, any hint that he knew about my visit. There was nothing. His expression was exactly what it had always been, tired, distracted, but genuinely glad to see me. Or so it seemed. "I brought you tea today," I said carefully. To your office. Leo paused in the middle of reaching for a glass. For just a fraction of a second, something shifted in his expression. Then he smiled. You did? I didn't get any tea. I gave it to Fiona to pass along. Another pause, so brief I might have imagined it. Oh. Fiona mentioned someone stopped by. I had back-to-back meetings all afternoon, so I probably missed it. He moved to the refrigerator, his back to me. That was sweet of you to think of me. I watched him pour himself a glass of wine, noting how his hands remained perfectly steady. Either he was telling the truth, or he was the most accomplished liar I'd ever met. After 25 years of marriage, I was terrified to discover which one it was. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal pantomime of normalcy. We watched the news, discussed our weekend plans, went through the same bedtime routine, but underneath it all, a terrible new awareness pulsed like a second heartbeat. As Leo slept beside me, his breathing deep and peaceful, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how many other lies I'd been living with. How many times had he come home from spending the day being Fiona's husband, only to slip seamlessly back into being mine? The numbers man in me, the analyst, was gone. The analyst in me started calculating. 3 years since Fiona joined the company. How many late nights? How many business trips? How many times had he mentioned her name? Conditioning me to accept her presence in his professional life, while she was actually inhabiting something much more personal. But the questions that haunted me most weren't about timelines or evidence. They were simpler. Who was the man sleeping next to me? And who had I been married to all these years? The next morning arrived with cruel normalcy. Leo kissed my cheek before leaving for work. The same quick peck he'd given me for years. He wore his favorite cologne, the one I'd bought him for Christmas. Everything about him was familiar, comforting, exactly as it had always been. Except now I knew I was kissing a stranger. I called my office and told my assistant I'd be working from home. For the first time in my 15-year practice, I couldn't bear the thought of discussing risk portfolios. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold, while I stared at Leo's tea mug in the sink. He'd used it that morning, just like always. Had he been thinking about Fiona while he drank from it? By noon, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. Going through Leo's things. Not frantically, but with the methodical precision that had made me a successful analyst. I started with his home office. The drawers revealed nothing suspicious. Work papers, company letterhead, business cards, but then I found something that made my stomach clench. A restaurant receipt from Le Jardin, the expensive French place downtown where we'd celebrated our anniversary 3 years running. It was dated 6 weeks ago, for 2 people, $368.50. I remembered that night clearly because Leo had told me he was having dinner with a potential client, a male client from Portland who was in town for just one evening. I stared at the receipt, my hands trembling. The timestamp showed 8:15 p.m. We talked on the phone that night around 9:30. He'd sounded relaxed, happy, describing his challenging but productive client meeting. But this wasn't a business dinner receipt. The line items were clear. 2 appetizers, 2 entrees, and a bottle of expensive Sancerre. No hard liquor, no multiple rounds of drinks that would accompany client entertainment. It was the kind of intimate dinner I thought was reserved for us. My phone rang, startling me. Leo's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, honey," I answered, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "Hey, I just wanted to check in. You sounded a little off this morning." His voice carried genuine concern, the kind of caring attention that had made me fall in love with him 26 years ago. "Just tired," I said. "Didn't sleep well. Maybe you should take a real break today. You've been working so hard lately." The irony of his suggestion wasn't lost on me. While I'd been working hard, he'd apparently been working hard at maintaining 2 separate lives. "Actually," I said, my voice cold, "I was thinking about that dinner you had with the client from Portland, the one about 6 weeks ago. How did that work out?" A pause. So brief that most people wouldn't notice it. But I did. In my job, A pause like that signifies risk. A calculation being run. He was calculating. Oh, that. It didn't pan out the way we'd hoped. He decided to go with a local firm. His voice remained steady. Casual. Why do you ask? Just curious. You seemed excited about it at the time. Well, you win some, you lose some. I could hear typing in the background. He was multitasking. Just like always. I should get back to this board meeting prep. See you tonight. See you tonight. After he hung up, I sat staring at the receipt. Either he was lying about the client meeting, or he was lying about the dinner. Either way, he was lying. My audit had just found its first major discrepancy. I spent the rest of the afternoon like a detective in my own life, examining familiar things with new eyes. My analyst's mind, which I usually applied to market trends and risk assessment, was now turned inward, auditing the 2 5-year-long prospectus of my marriage. The physical receipt from Le Jardin was damning, but it was a single data point. I needed a trend line. I moved to the credit card statements. For years, I'd trusted Leo to handle our main joint finances. I made 3 times what he did when we first got married. But as his star rose at zenith, he took over the bill payments, claiming it made him feel useful, a traditional gesture I'd found endearing. Now, it felt like a deliberate move to obscure the data. I pulled up the statements line by line. The discrepancies were small at first, almost imperceptible. Lunch charges on days when he told me he was brown bagging it to save money. Gas station purchases in neighborhoods across town, far from his usual routes. Then I saw it. A charge at a high-end electronics boutique for $3,712 on a Tuesday afternoon when he'd supposedly been in back-to-back meetings. Leo hadn't bought a new piece of tech for himself in years, claiming he was too tired after work to focus on anything but trade magazines. What had he bought? A gift? But the most damning discovery came from his laptop. He'd left it open on the kitchen counter, something he'd been doing more frequently over the past year. I told myself I was just closing it to save the battery, but my eyes caught a notification bubble in the corner of the screen. Fiona Shaw had sent him a calendar invitation. I shouldn't have clicked on it. I knew I was crossing a line, violating his privacy in a way that would have horrified me just 24 hours earlier. But 24 hours earlier, I'd believed my husband was faithful. The calendar invitation was for dinner. Tonight, 7 p.m., at Il Cielo, the Italian place that had become our special occasion restaurant, the place where I had proposed to him 17 years ago. A moment of spontaneous joy I'd treasured. The reservation was under Fiona's name. My chest felt tight as I scrolled through more calendar entries. Lunch meeting with F, that weren't labeled as business. Doctor's appointments that Leo had never mentioned to me. A weekend spa retreat 3 months ago that he'd told me was a men's leadership conference. But the entries that made me physically nauseous were the recurring ones. Coffee with F every Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. Dinner plans every other Thursday. Weekend planning marked for this coming Saturday, when Leo had told me he needed to work to finalize a quarterly report. I was looking at a parallel life, meticulously scheduled and carefully hidden. Fiona wasn't just his work colleague, or even his affair partner. Based on these calendar entries, she was his primary relationship. I was the side note, the obligation, the legacy asset he hadn't yet divested from. The garage door rumbled open at 6:15. Leo was home early, unusual for a Thursday. I closed the laptop quickly, my heart hammering as I heard his shoes on the kitchen tile. "You're home early," I said, amazed at the steadiness of my own voice. He looked beautiful, I realized with a sharp pang. He'd refreshed his haircut. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne, and he was wearing the black dress shirt I'd bought him for his birthday last year. The shirt, he'd said, was too fancy for everyday wear. I managed to wrap up early for once. He moved past me to the refrigerator, his cologne trailing behind him. "I thought maybe we could grab dinner out tonight. It's been forever since we did anything spontaneous." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered that I almost believed it myself. If I hadn't seen the calendar invitation, I would have been thrilled by his suggestion. I would have rushed to change clothes, grateful for this unexpected attention. Where did you have in mind? I asked, testing the parameters of his deception. Oh, I don't know. Maybe that new sushi place on 5th Street, or we could try something completely different. He was checking his phone as he spoke, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. I watched him type, wondering if he was texting Fiona. Was he canceling their dinner? Rescheduling? Actually, he said, looking up from his phone with apparent disappointment. I just remembered I have that conference call with the Tokyo office. It totally slipped my mind. He shook his head ruefully. Rain check? Of course. The words came out automatically, but inside, something cold and hard was crystallizing. What time is your call? 7:30. Could run until 9 or 10. You know how these international things go. He was already moving toward the stairs. I'll probably just grab something quick on my way back to the office. I nodded, playing my part. I'll make myself something here. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at me with what appeared to be genuine affection. You're so understanding, Grace. I don't know what I'd do without you. The words that should have warmed my heart instead felt like ice picks. How many times had he said variations of this while preparing to spend the evening with another woman? 20 minutes later, he came back down wearing a navy blazer and dark slacks. Professional, attractive, he looked like a man preparing for an important evening, not a long phone conference. He kissed my cheek. I'll try not to be too late. The house felt different after he left. Not empty, but haunted. At 8:30, I found myself driving past Il Cielo. I told myself I was just going to the grocery store, but when I saw Leo's silver BMW in the restaurant parking lot, parked next to a dark Mercedes I assumed belonged to Fiona, the last thread of hope I'd been clinging to snapped. They were in there right now, in our restaurant, sharing the kind of intimate dinner I thought was exclusive to our marriage. Were they planning a future that didn't include me? I drove home in a daze. My wife of 25 years was living a double life. The husband I thought I knew was a stranger. The revelation came 3 days later. In the most mundane way possible. I was cleaning out the junk drawer in the kitchen, something I did quarterly to keep our household organized, when my fingers closed around a key fob I didn't recognize. It was sleek black plastic, attached to a simple silver ring. On the back, etched in small white letters, was the Apex Residences. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind processing. We owned our house outright. Neither of us had any reason to have an apartment key fob, let alone one from a complex 30 minutes away, in the city's newest, most exclusive district. That afternoon, while Leo was at what he'd called a client presentation, I drove to the Apex Residences. The complex was nice, upscale, but not ostentatious, the kind of place where successful professionals might keep a discreet second residence. I sat in my car in the visitor parking area, staring at the fob and wondering if I really wanted to know what door it opened. The answer came when I saw Fiona's Mercedes pull into a numbered space. I watched her get out, carrying a grocery bag and what looked like dry cleaning. She moved with the easy familiarity of someone coming home, not someone visiting. When she disappeared into Building C, I waited exactly 10 minutes before following. The fob fit perfectly against the security panel. The door opened onto a life I never knew existed. It wasn't a temporary hiding place. It was a home. A fully furnished, lived-in home with abstract art on the walls, books on the shelves, and Leo's favorite leather throw pillows arranged on a couch I'd never seen before. But it was the photos that destroyed me completely. Leo and Fiona at what looked like a company Christmas party, his arm around her waist in a possessive, intimate way. The two of them on a beach I didn't recognize, both tanned and relaxed. Leo wearing swim trunks I'd never seen, Fiona kissing his cheek while he laughed. His left hand was visible and notably bare of the wedding ring he wore at home. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, cataloging evidence of a relationship that was clearly far more than an affair. This was a second life, complete and established. In the bedroom, Leo's clothes hung next to Fiona's in a shared closet. His cologne sat on the dresser next to her perfume. The bathroom held 2 toothbrushes. His contact solution. The expensive face cream he claimed was too costly to repurchase when he'd run out 6 months ago. On the kitchen counter, I found the most devastating evidence of all. A folder labeled Future Plans. In Leo's neat, meticulous handwriting, inside were house listings in Fiona's name, vacation brochures, and a business plan for expanding Zenith Solutions. With Fiona listed as managing director and Leo as president, but at the bottom of the folder was something that made my hands shake. A consultation summary from Daniel Miller and Associates, the firm my family had used for decades. The firm that had handled our wills 5 years ago. According to the summary, Leo had met with them twice in the past 4 months to discuss optimal divorce strategies for high-asset individuals. The document outlined his approach in clinical detail. He planned to file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional abandonment. The strategy involved establishing a pattern of my alleged emotional unavailability, supported by what the lawyer called lifestyle incompatibility evidence. According to this plan, my preference for quiet evenings at home would be presented as social isolation. My satisfaction with my small analyst practice would become lack of ambition. My contentment with our modest lifestyle would be reframed as an inability to support his professional growth. But the most chilling part was the timeline. Leo had been planning this divorce for at least 2 years, carefully documenting instances of what he called my withdrawn behavior. He'd been creating a narrative of our marriage that painted me as an inadequate wife who'd gradually become emotionally unavailable. The man I'd been living with, loving, trusting, had been systematically building a case against me while I remained completely oblivious. I sat on their couch, surrounded by evidence of their shared life, and tried to process the magnitude of the deception. This wasn't just an affair. This was a calculated replacement. A hostile takeover of my life. Fiona hadn't just stolen my husband. She'd systematically assumed my role, while I was gradually being written out of the story. My phone buzzed. A text from Leo. Running late tonight. Don't wait up. Love you. The same words he'd probably texted me from this very apartment. Maybe while Fiona was cooking dinner in their kitchen. I photographed everything with my phone. My analyst's mind automatically creating the documentation I'd need later. For 3 days, I'd been tormented by uncertainty. Now I had answers, and while they were devastating, they were also clarifying. The man I'd been married to for 25 years had spent the last several years methodically erasing me from his future. When I got home from the Apex residences, I found Leo's laptop open on the kitchen counter again. He had grown arrogant in his deception, so confident in my passivity that he no longer bothered to cover his tracks. This time, I didn't hesitate. My actions were no longer driven by the shocked grief of a wife. They were guided by the cold, methodical precision of a financial analyst conducting a forensic audit. I had seen the consultation summary from Daniel Miller. I knew the narrative he was building. Now, I needed to see the raw data behind his strategy. I opened his email. The correspondence confirmed everything I'd discovered at the apartment. Messages between Leo and Fiona, discussing not just dinners, but logistics. When to make the transition. How to handle the Q4 report rollout simultaneously with the personal news. Communications with his lawyer, Daniel Miller, about preparing Grace for the inevitable changes and minimizing asset exposure. But it was one email to his sister Sarah, dated just 2 weeks ago. That was the most devastating. Grace has been so distant lately, he wrote. I think she's going through some kind of midlife crisis, but she won't talk about it. She's completely buried in her work. No ambition for anything else. I'm trying to be patient, but I can't sacrifice my own happiness indefinitely. Fiona thinks I should consider all my options. Reading this, I realized that Leo hadn't just been living a double life. He'd been actively rewriting our marriage history to justify his planned exit. Every quiet evening I'd spent reading while he worked on his laptop, every time I'd encouraged him to pursue his career ambitions, even when it meant less time together, every instance of my being supportive, rather than demanding, had been transformed into evidence of my inadequacy as a wife. The cruelest part was recognizing how he'd manipulated my own contentment, my lack of drama, into a character flaw. But the emotional audit was complete. It was time for the financial one. This was my turf. For 25 years, our finances had been merged. But my small, successful practice had always been the more significant contributor. I had set up our investment portfolios, our retirement accounts, our high-yield savings. Leo, with his managing director title, earned a handsome salary. But my income as a top-tier analyst consistently outpaced his. I had been the one funding the lifestyle he was now claiming I couldn't keep up with. I logged into our joint brokerage account. I logged into our savings. I started building a spreadsheet. My fingers flew across the keys, cross-referencing dates from his calendar with withdrawals and transfers. The pattern that emerged was chilling. 3 years ago, when Fiona started at Zenith, the small, unexplained withdrawals began. Client entertainment, he'd said. Then, 2 years ago, when the dinner with F entries became regular, he'd suggested we open a new joint checking account for household expenses, arguing it was simpler. I'd agreed. Now I saw why. He'd been diverting a significant portion of my monthly income deposit into that new account, while his own salary was being rerouted to a private account I'd never known existed. He was using my money to pay the rent on the Apex residences, the lease on Fiona's Mercedes, the dinners at Le Jardin, the $3,712 electronics purchase, all of it, documented in his neat, meticulous transfers. He hadn't just been funding his affair. He'd been systematically draining our joint assets to build a new life, all while preparing to divorce me for being financially unambitious. I sat back, the glow of the laptop illuminating the dark kitchen. The man I had loved wasn't just an adulterer. He was a fraud. He had been cooking the books of our marriage for years. The front door opened at nearly 11. Leo came in, apologizing for his late evening with client entertainment. He kissed my cheek, the same spot he'd kissed that morning, and asked about my day. The same routine we'd followed for years, but now I could see it for what it was. A performance. A quarterly review designed to maintain the status quo until he was ready to execute his exit strategy. "How was the client dinner?" I asked, testing his reaction, my voice devoid of any emotion he could detect. "Productive, I think. We're trying to land this big contract." He moved around the kitchen, making himself a cup of tea. Fiona was there too, of course, since she'll be managing the account if we get it. Fiona was there too. Of course she was, I thought. I wondered if they'd laughed about this conversation later, in their shared apartment. "That's good," I said. "You and Fiona work well together." Leo paused, cup halfway to his lips. "We do." There was something in his voice, a warmth that he used to reserve for talking about me. "She really understands the business side of things. She's been instrumental in some of our biggest wins lately." I nodded, playing my part in this elaborate charade. But inside, I was calculating. How long did I have before he filed? How many more assets would he try to hide? As I lay in bed that night, listening to his peaceful breathing, I realized the man I'd been married to was gone. In his place was someone who could plan my emotional and financial destruction while accepting my love and support. The question now wasn't whether my marriage was over. The question was how to liquidate it without being taken for everything I had. I chose Saturday morning for the confrontation. Leo was in our kitchen, wearing the pale yellow robe I'd bought him 3 Christmases ago, sipping coffee from his favorite mug while scrolling through his phone. It was the kind of peaceful domestic scene that had once filled me with contentment. Now it felt like watching a performance I could no longer pretend to believe. "We need to talk," I said. I set a single 1-inch thick binder on the kitchen table between us. It wasn't a random pile of papers. It was a bound report, with tabbed sections, just as I would prepare for a client. Leo looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from casual attention to sharp awareness as he saw the binder. His coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. And for just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face that might have been relief. "What's this about?" he asked. But his voice lacked the confusion it should have carried. He knew exactly what this was about. I went to your apartment yesterday, I said, sitting down across from him. The one at the Apex Residences. I slid the black key fob across the table. It stopped next to his coffee mug. Leo set down his mug with deliberate precision. When he looked at me again, the mask was gone. The loving husband, the concerned partner, the man who'd been apologizing for late nights all disappeared. In his place sat someone I barely recognized. Someone whose eyes held a coldness I'd never seen before. I see. His voice was calm, matter of fact. How much do you know? The question hit me like a physical blow. Not denial. Not confusion. Not even anger. Just a practical inquiry about the extent of my discovery, as if we were discussing a business problem that needed to be managed. Everything, I said, my voice just as cold. I tapped the binder. I know about Fiona. I know about the apartment. I know about the divorce planning, the legal strategy. All of it. I know you've been meeting with Daniel Miller to build a case against me for emotional abandonment. Leo nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the table. He was calculating. Processing. How long have you known? Since Thursday. When I visited your office and the security guard told me he saw your wife every day. He meant Fiona. Something that might have been amusement passed across Leo's features. Poor Walter. He's always been a bit too chatty. He reached for his coffee again, his movements unhurried. I suppose this complicates things. Complicates things? I could hear my own voice, flat and dangerous. Leo, we've been married for 25 years. You've been living with another woman, planning to divorce me? And all you can say is that this complicates things? He sighed, a sound of mild irritation. Grace, let's not be dramatic about this. We both know this marriage has been over for years. We both know? I stared at him. I didn't know anything. I thought we were happy. Leo's laugh was short and utterly without humor. Happy? Grace, when was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you showed any interest in my career, my goals, anything beyond your little risk assessment spreadsheets? I've always supported your career. I've always been proud of what you've accomplished. You've been passive, he corrected, his voice taking on the sharp edge I'd heard him use with underperforming employees. You've been content to let me carry the social obligations, the responsibility for actually building a life worth living. You've been perfectly happy to coast along in your comfortable little routine while I've been growing, changing, becoming someone who needs more than you've ever been willing to offer. Each word felt like a carefully aimed dart, hitting the exact targets I'd seen outlined in his lawyer's summary. If you felt that way, why didn't you talk to me? I tried, Grace. God knows I tried. But every time I brought up traveling more, expanding your practice, moving to a better neighborhood, you found excuses. You were always perfectly satisfied. So you decided to replace me instead of work with me. And you decided to use my money to do it. I opened the binder to the second tab, labeled Financial Discrepancies, and spun it around for him to see. Spreadsheets, bank statements, timelines. You've been subsidizing your new life with my income for 24 months. You've been systematically diverting my earnings to pay for your apartment, your dinners, your gifts to her, all while building a case that I was the one who was financially unambitious. You haven't just been unfaithful, Leo. You've been committing fraud. For the first time, his composure cracked. He stared at the numbers, his face paling. He hadn't expected an audit. Do you love her? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Leo's expression softened for the first time, but not in a way that offered me any comfort. I do. I love Fiona in a way I never loved you. She challenges me, inspires me, makes me want to be better. With her, I feel like I'm living instead of just existing. And with me? He looked at me, his gaze neither cruel nor kind, just honest. With you, I felt safe, comfortable, unchallenged. For a long time I thought that was enough. But it isn't, Grace. I want more than safe. I sat in silence, absorbing the weight of his words. 25 years. And what he'd valued most about me was my ability to provide stability. What I'd seen as a partnership, he'd experienced as stagnation. What happens now? I asked, closing the binder. Leo sat back, his posture relaxing as we moved into practical territory. Now we handle this like adults. I was going to file for divorce next month anyway. This just accelerates the timeline. Next month? You and Fiona want to be married by Christmas, don't you? He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. We've been planning our future. The divorce was always going to be necessary. Gerald, I said, using the wrong name on purpose. He flinched. No, wait. That was the other one. Leo, you'll be fine. You have your new life. Your ambitions. You'll probably be happier without the pressure of trying to keep up with someone like me. I threw his own condescending narrative back at him. I stood up, feeling older than my 56 years. I'll contact a lawyer on Monday. Grace, he called as I reached the kitchen doorway. When I turned back, he looked almost like the man I'd thought I'd married. I really am sorry it happened this way. I never wanted to hurt you. I studied his face, looking for any sign that he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. But there was only mild regret. No, I said quietly. You just wanted to replace me. The hurt was just collateral damage. As I walked upstairs to our bedroom, I could hear Leo on the phone. His voice was animated in a way it hadn't been during our conversation. He was calling Fiona, I realized, telling her that the secret was out, that they could accelerate their timeline. I sat on the edge of our bed, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd thought was real. The Grace who'd woken up that morning, believing in her marriage, was gone. Tomorrow, I would start the process of untangling 25 years of a shared life. But tonight, I needed to grieve not just for my marriage, but for the woman I'd been when I still believed in it. Monday morning, I sat across from David Morrison, a senior partner at a rival law firm to my family's old one. The irony was bitter. Leo had consulted with Daniel Miller, a man who had attended my father's funeral to strategize my financial ruin. Now, I was sitting in a sterile, unfamiliar office, preparing to dismantle the life I had built. Grace, I have to tell you, this is one of the most calculated divorce strategies I've seen in 30 years of practice, David said, his voice grim. He was reviewing the binder I had presented, the one I'd shown Leo. He was still on the first tab, the narrative strategy, which detailed Leo's plan to paint me as emotionally unavailable. That's his plan, I said, my voice flat. This is the reality. I reached forward and flipped the binder to the second tab. Financial discrepancies. David Morrison, a man known for his sharp financial acumen in high-asset divorces, leaned forward. His eyes scanned the first spreadsheet, and his demeanor shifted from sympathetic counsel to focused professional. What am I looking at? He asked. You're looking at fraud, I said. Leo's narrative depends on me being a passive wife with no ambition. The financial facts state the opposite. I have been the primary earner for 18 of our 25 years. My practice generates, on average, 80% of our household income. I pointed to the highlighted transfer statements. For the past 3 years, I have been contributing the majority of my income to our joint accounts, which I believed were for our retirement, our future. But as you can see, for the past 24 months, Leo has been systematically diverting those funds. He used my income to pay the lease on the Apex residences. He used my income to lease Fiona's Mercedes. He used my income to pay for their dinners, their vacations, and the gifts he bought her. He was siphoning my money while simultaneously building a legal case that I was the one who was financially unambitious and emotionally withdrawn. David was silent for a full minute. His fingers steepled. He wasn't just planning to divorce you, Grace. He was planning to make you pay for his exit. His expression hardened. This isn't just infidelity. This is constructive fraud. He has been strategically commingling and diverting assets you primarily earned to fund an adulterous relationship. This changes the entire landscape of the asset division. His claim of emotional abandonment is a smokescreen, designed to make you feel guilty so you wouldn't look too closely at the numbers. He was banking on you being too heartbroken to be analytical. He miscalculated, I said quietly. He fundamentally misunderstood his opponent, David agreed. His strategy depended on you being unprepared and uninformed. The fact that you discovered this before he filed changes everything. We file first. Today, we get ahead of his narrative, and we present the facts before he can spin them. Your audit, he tapped the binder, is the weapon. His narrative is based on subjective claims. Yours is based on indisputable data. What are my options? We file, and we file aggressively. We petition to freeze the joint accounts immediately, citing financial misconduct. We subpoena his private bank records. We make it clear that his narrative of the emotionally distant wife is a complete fabrication, contradicted by the financial reality that you were the one generously funding the entire marriage while he was stealing from it. I nodded, absorbing the strategy. It was clean. It was logical, but I wasn't done, I said, my voice dropping. David raised an eyebrow. There's more? I pulled a second, thinner folder from my briefcase. While he was busy documenting my emotional failures over the weekend, I was quietly analyzing his professional ones. He didn't just defraud me, David. He's been defrauding his company. David Morrison leaned back in his leather chair, his expression thoughtful. Explain. This is the business plan I found in their apartment. I slid the document across the desk. The one where Leo makes himself president of Zenith Solutions and installs Fiona as the new managing director. My practice analyzes corporate structures for risk. So, I analyzed Zenith Solutions, I continued. I spent all weekend reviewing their publicly available corporate filings, shareholder reports, and board minutes. I cross-referenced them with this new business plan. Leo has been systematically transferring key responsibilities and assets to Fiona that should require board approval. He's been positioning her to take over his role, but he has never presented this reorganization to the board officially. He's been operating under the assumption that he can unilaterally restructure the company to benefit his romantic partner. I pointed to a line item I'd circled. He's been implementing elements of this plan for 6 months, all off the books. The board doesn't know about their personal relationship, and they certainly don't know about the corporate reorganization he's been implementing without their approval. He is in clear violation of his fiduciary duty to the company's board and its stockholders. David was now taking notes rapidly. Grace, this isn't just about your divorce anymore. If what you're saying is accurate, Leo could be facing serious professional consequences. This is leverage on a scale he cannot possibly anticipate. What do you recommend? I asked. We file the divorce petition this afternoon, David said without hesitation. And you make sure the board at Zenith Solutions understands what's been happening under their noses. This isn't just leverage. It's a matter of corporate integrity. That afternoon, I did something that went against every instinct I'd developed over our 25-year marriage. I stopped protecting Leo from the consequences of his actions. I called Rebecca Holt, the chairwoman of Zenith's board of directors. Rebecca and I had met several times at charity functions. I'd always liked her straightforward, no-nonsense approach. Grace, what can I do for you? Rebecca's voice was warm, unsuspecting. Rebecca, I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. I need to bring something to your attention regarding corporate governance issues at Zenith. It's complicated, but I think the board needs to be aware of some structural changes that may not have been properly authorized. There was a pause. What kind of structural changes? I spent the next 20 minutes carefully outlining what I'd discovered, sticking to facts and avoiding the personal, emotional details of my marriage. I described the unauthorized reorganization, the conflict of interest, and the business plan I had found. Rebecca listened without interruption, her silence more telling than any words. My God, Grace, she said finally, her voice cold as steel. Are you saying Leo's been implementing major corporate changes without board approval? I'm saying that based on the documents I've seen, there appears to be a significant disconnect between what's been happening operationally and what's been reported to the board. And you're bringing this to me because... I took a deep breath. Because I believe in corporate integrity, and because the board has a right to know what's being done in their name. That evening, Leo came home later than usual. His face was tight with stress. His usual composed demeanor cracked around the edges. "We need to talk," he said, setting his briefcase down with more force than necessary. "About what?" "About the call Rebecca Holt made to me this afternoon. About the emergency corporate governance review the board has suddenly decided to conduct." His eyes were hard, calculating. "About the fact that my own wife is apparently trying to destroy my career." I met his gaze steadily. I shared factual information about corporate reorganization that appeared to lack proper authorization. Nothing more. "Don't play innocent with me, Grace. You knew exactly what you were doing." "Yes," I said, my voice clear and cold. "I did. The same way you knew exactly what you were doing when you spent 2 years planning my replacement. Your affair with Fiona affects your professional reputation too. The board was going to find out eventually. I just gave them a head start." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about me. The passive, supportive, unambitious wife was gone. In her place was someone who understood the value of information and wasn't afraid to use it. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice low. "I want you to stop treating me like I'm stupid," I said. "I want you to acknowledge that your actions have consequences beyond your personal happiness. And I want you to understand that I'm not going to quietly disappear just because it would be convenient for your new life plan." That night, as Leo made frantic phone calls behind closed doors, I could hear the stress in his voice. I realized something fundamental had shifted. For 25 years, I'd been the one adapting, accommodating, making space for his ambitions. Now, for the first time, he was the one having to adapt to consequences he couldn't control. Leo had built his new life on the assumption that I would remain passive, predictable, and manageable. He was about to discover how wrong that assumption had been. The next morning, I filed for divorce, but more importantly, I stopped being the woman who made Leo's life easier at the expense of my own dignity. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment, making coffee for one, and finding a genuine, uncomplicated peace in the simplicity of it. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows I'd chosen, in a space that was entirely mine, free from the weight of deception and the false harmony that had defined my life for so long. My new home was smaller than the house, but it was 100% my asset, unencumbered by lies. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago. It had not been the ugly, protracted battle Leo had prepared for with Daniel Miller. It had been, as my lawyer David Morrison called it, a strategic liquidation. When faced with the binder, not just the evidence of his fraud, but the irrefutable proof of his breach of fiduciary duty at Zenith, Leo's legal strategy collapsed. His narrative of the emotionally unavailable wife was useless against a spreadsheet detailing his theft. David had presented our terms: a quiet, swift settlement, or a very public lawsuit that would include the findings of the Zenith Board review. Leo folded. He had no choice. I kept the house, the colonial we'd shared for 20 years, but which my income had largely paid for and maintained. He kept his retirement accounts and half of our savings, minus the exact amount I had meticulously documented he'd diverted to fund his secret life with Fiona. It was fair. It was a precise, mathematical correction of the ledger. But the real satisfaction came not from the financial settlement, but from watching Leo face the consequences of choices he'd thought he could make without accountability. The corporate governance review at Zenith Solutions had been thorough, swift, and devastating. Rebecca Holt, true to her reputation, had shown no mercy. Fiona Shaw had been terminated immediately. Her position as director of operations had been contingent on her professional judgment, and her romantic involvement with the managing director, combined with her role in his unauthorized restructuring plan, represented an irreconcilable conflict of interest. I learned through professional acquaintances that she had moved to Seattle, just as they'd planned, but not for the new life they envisioned. She took a position with a smaller firm at considerably less money. Leo had managed to keep his job, but barely. He had not been fired. Rebecca had engineered a crueler, more fitting punishment. He was stripped of the title of managing director and demoted to a senior advisory role with no direct reports. His decision-making authority was revoked, and he was required to report to a newly appointed chief operating officer, who essentially supervised his every move. The man who had built his identity around professional power, who had dreamed of becoming president, was now working under closer oversight than he'd experienced since his first corporate job. Their apartment at the Apex Residences had been given up quietly. Their great love, built on the thrill of secrecy and the excitement of shared ambition, had apparently evaporated once the secrecy was gone and the ambition was crushed. I learned about these developments not through direct contact, but through the small network of mutual friends and professional acquaintances that inevitably carried news. Some of these people had reached out to me after the divorce, expressing surprise, and in a few cases, apologizing for having believed Leo's carefully constructed narrative about our marriage's decline. "I had no idea, Grace," one had said. "He made it sound like you'd grown apart gradually, like it was mutual." These conversations had been validating in ways I hadn't expected. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I'd really been as inadequate a wife as Leo had claimed. Learning that even his closest professional colleagues had been deceived helped me understand that his capacity for manipulation extended far beyond our marriage. But the most profound change wasn't in Leo's circumstances. It was in my own relationship with myself. For the first time in decades, I was living without the constant, low-grade hum of someone else's dissatisfaction. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending trying to anticipate Leo's needs, accommodate his moods, and compensate for whatever was missing in our relationship. I'd even started dating, something I'd thought would be impossible. Mark was a history professor I'd met at a charity auction. A kind, thoughtful man who appreciated conversation about books and enjoyed quiet dinners without needing them to be productions. He found my contentment with simple pleasures grounding rather than limiting, and his uncomplicated affection was a revelation. The strangest part was realizing how much happier I was without the marriage I'd thought I'd been fighting to save. Leo had been right about one thing. We had grown incompatible. He'd become someone who could maintain elaborate deceptions while accepting love from someone he was actively betraying. I'd remained someone who believed in honesty and loyalty. One evening in late spring, I was sitting on the small balcony of my apartment, reading and enjoying the sunset, when my phone rang. Leo's name appeared on the screen. The first time he'd called since our divorce was finalized. I almost didn't answer. But my curiosity, my analytical need for final data, won out. "Hello, Leo." "Grace." His voice sounded tired, older somehow. I hope I'm not disturbing you. "What can I do for you, Leo?" There was a long pause. I wanted to apologize for how everything happened, for the way I handled things. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did. I waited, saying nothing. "You didn't deserve what I put you through," he continued. "I convinced myself that our marriage was already over, that I was just being honest about reality. But the truth is, I ended it long before I admitted it. I ended it when I decided you weren't enough anymore, instead of trying to work with you." I found myself genuinely curious. "What's prompted this reflection?" He let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but without humor. "Losing everything I thought I wanted. Fiona and I lasted exactly 6 weeks after she moved to Seattle. Turns out our great love affair was more about the thrill of planning a hostile takeover than about actually wanting to live together day to day." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. "I'm sorry you threw away 25 years for something that wasn't real. I'm sorry you hurt so many people in pursuit of something that didn't exist. Do you ever think about what might have happened if I'd just talked to you?" he asked, his voice small. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But Leo, the problem wasn't that you felt restless or wanted more from life. The problem was that you chose deception and fraud instead of honest communication. You chose to replace me instead of working with me. I know that now." You're right," he said. "And even in this apology, Leo," I added, the analyst in me unable to resist the final summary, You're focusing on the outcome that didn't work out for you. You're sorry that your strategy failed. Not sorry that your strategy involved systematically betraying someone who loved you. Silence stretched between us. I hope you're happy, Grace, he said finally. I hope you found someone who appreciates what I was too selfish to value. I have, I said, thinking of Mark. His name is Mark, and he's everything you never were. Honest, kind, and capable of love without manipulation. Good. You deserve that. After he hung up, I sat on my balcony as the sun finished setting, thinking about the strange, painful journey that had brought me to this peaceful evening. A year ago, I'd been living a lie, married to someone who was systematically planning my replacement. Now I was alone but not lonely. I'd learned that contentment wasn't a character flaw. My capacity for loyalty and trust, while it had made me vulnerable to exploitation, was also what made me capable of real intimacy. Leo had seen my satisfaction with our quiet life as evidence of my limitations. Mark saw it as evidence of my strength. As I turned off the lights in my small, honest apartment, I realized that for the first time in years, my life's portfolio was perfectly balanced. I was exactly where I belonged.